Allison sat by the window in a small coffee shop on the main street. After a hard day, she had chosen this place to be alone. It was starting to rain outside, and the light of the street lamps was spreading out on the wet asphalt. It was a place of neither comfort nor peace in her life right now. Her previous relationships had left deep scars on her heart, and now she was building walls around herself to protect herself from new disappointments. She took a sip of coffee, trying to push away the heavy thoughts. After breaking up with her ex-boyfriend, her life had become an endless struggle for emotional balance. But suddenly her inner monologue was interrupted by a familiar voice. "Allison? Is that you?" She looked up and saw Jared. It was an old acquaintance of hers with whom she had a connection in the past. A dark-skinned man with a charismatic smile that he always used as a weapon. He looked confident, dressed in a stylish black trench coat. His eyes sparkled, as if he knew exactly what to do next. "Jared, wow, it's been a long time." She smiled forcedly, not sure whether to be happy or wary of him. "It's been a long time." He carefully sat down at her table. "How are you?" Allison spoke briefly about her current situation. Generalities about work, life, and trying to start from scratch. Jared listened attentively, not interrupting. His presence had something soothing about it, as if he were an old friend who had come to the rescue at the most opportune moment. "If you need someone to support you, I'm always here for you," he said with a hint of sympathy. "Let's meet for coffee sometime, for old time's sake." Allison shrugged her shoulders. The idea sounded good, although she wasn't sure if she should let someone from her past back into her life. But at this point, she didn't want to seem ungrateful. "Okay, we can get together sometime," she replied. A few days later, they met again, this time in a park where Jared brought coffee and started talking about his life. He worked in finance, had a fairly successful career, and seemed to be a self-sufficient person. His words sounded confident, but they had a slight manipulative edge to them, as if he was trying to gain her trust. "You know," Jared said thoughtfully, "sometimes it seems like old friends come back into our lives for a reason. Maybe we still have some unfinished business?" Allison laughed, trying to avoid the topic, but Jared was watching her reaction closely. He gradually gained her trust by reminding her of the moments when they were close. He was also careful not to appear intrusive. Meanwhile, another man appeared in Allison's life, Andy. He was a lawyer and met her at work by chance. Their relationship developed calmly and naturally. Andy was the opposite of Jared, soft and attentive, without a trace of control or manipulation. He invited her to dinner, and she accepted, feeling that she could be happy with him. The evening with Andy turned out to be pleasant. They walked along the river, discussed plans for the future, and laughed at trivial things. Allison felt that she was beginning to trust this man. He gave her a small bouquet of violets, and she found this gesture very touching. However, after this meeting, Jared began to show signs of jealousy. He would suddenly show up at her house, call her unannounced, and ask her who she was spending time with. Allison didn't want to get into a fight, but she felt that his control was becoming intrusive. One day, as Allison was sitting at home flipping through her phone, she received a message from Jared. "Do you really think he loves you? He's just playing with you, just like everyone else." These words confused her. Why was he so concerned about her personal life? Was he going too far? The next day, Jared met her at work and apologized for the message. He brought her a locket as a gift, saying he wanted her to always remember their friendship. Allison hesitated, but took the gift to avoid conflict. The medallion was beautiful, with an antique design, but something about the gesture alarmed her. She tried to keep her distance from Jared, but he remained a part of her life, like an invisible shadow following her. Allison realized that she had to make a choice. She was attracted to Andy, but Jared was still present in her life, creating feelings of guilt and dependence. She couldn't find a way out of this situation, and the internal conflict was becoming more and more unbearable. On the last night of this chapter, Allison decided to give herself a chance at happiness. She arranged a new meeting with Andy and began to think about the possibility of moving to another city. This plan seemed like a lifesaver, but she knew that Jared would hardly take it well. Meanwhile, it started raining outside again, and Allison's phone rang. It was Jared. She didn't answer it, but she felt he was still there, too close to disappear from her life. As the days passed, Jared gradually took over more and more space in Allison's life. He showed up when he wasn't expected, was constantly around, and under the guise of caring, controlled her every move. At first it seemed to Allison that he just wanted to help, but over time, it began to cause her anxiety. After each meeting with Jared, she felt as if she had lost a piece of herself. One day they met for lunch at a cafe that was Allison's favorite place. Jared brought her a book that she had mentioned for a long time that she wanted to read. It touched her, but also confused her. It was as if he could read her mind and anticipate her every desire. "You always know what I want," she smiled, but there was tension in her voice. "Because I know you, Allie," he said with a warm smile. This phrase sounded wary, but Allison didn't attach much importance to it. She didn't want to seem rude and continued to play the role of a grateful friend, although something in Jared's behavior began to scare her. Meanwhile, her relationship with Andy was growing closer. He was completely different, gentle, attentive, and ready to listen. Andy didn't ask unnecessary questions or try to impose his will. When they spent time together, Allison felt light and calm. One day they decided to take a walk in the park. The air was filled with freshness after the rain, and the trees were shining under the light of the autumn sun. Andy brought her a new bouquet of violets, and this gesture made her heart leap with joy again. "You know, these violets remind me of my grandmother," she said, holding the bouquet in her hands. "She loved them so much." "Now they can remind you of us," Andy replied with a warm smile. Allison felt that there was something special between them, something that gave her hope for a new beginning. At that very moment, however, she thought of Jared. She began to feel guilty, as if she were betraying his trust, even though there had never been anything romantic between them. Jared began to notice changes in Allison's behavior. He was becoming more and more obsessive, and his jealousy was coming to the surface. One day, he showed up at her house unannounced when she was just returning from a meeting with Andy. "Where have you been?" he asked with a soft but palpable hint of reproach. "With a friend," she replied shortly, trying to avoid conflict. "That lawyer, right? You know he's not what he seems. He's going to use you and leave you like all the others. It's none of your business, Jared. I can decide who I want to spend time with." For the first time, she felt like she had to set a boundary, but his reaction made her scared. "I'm just trying to protect you, Allie," he said. "You know I'm always on your side." Allison realized that these words sounded more like a warning than a concern. She decided it was time to limit her contact with Jared, but it was harder than she expected. He always found a way to get back into her life, even when she tried to keep her distance. A few days later, Jared showed up at her work again. He looked calm, as if nothing had happened. "I think you should keep this to yourself," he said, holding out the locket he had given her earlier. Allison took the jewelry, not wanting to create a new conflict. The medallion was engraved with a date that she did not immediately notice. It was the day they first met. "It's a symbol of our friendship," he explained, "so that you can always remember that I'm here for you." These words left a bitter taste in her mouth. Allison realized that Jared was not going to let her go. His attachment was too strong and dangerous. Her relationship with Andy continued to develop, but every time they spent time together, Allison felt Jared's shadow. She knew he was watching her, not directly, but through messages, chance meetings, constant calls. His presence was so overwhelming that she began to question her own decisions. "What's wrong with you?" Andy asked one day when they were walking together. "You look tense." "Nothing's wrong," she lied, but something was breaking inside her. She felt like she was trapped and couldn't get out. The last straw was the day Allison received a message from Jared. "I know he won't make you happy. You still belong to me, Allie." These words finally broke her. She realized that she had to break this vicious cycle, or she would lose herself. She called Andy and asked him to meet her in the evening. They decided that it was time to talk about the future and perhaps start a new phase together. However, Allison felt that this decision would not be without consequences. She knew that Jared would not forgive her for this betrayal, a betrayal that existed only in his imagination. Ever since Allison had decided to take a step toward new feelings with Andy, her anxiety had increased. She felt that every day Jared was putting more and more pressure on her, like a spider slowly tightening its web. He called constantly, left messages, and randomly showed up in places she didn't expect to see him. One evening, as Allison was preparing to meet Andy, Jared called again. She reluctantly answered, trying not to give him a reason for conflict. "What do you want, Jared?" she asked in a tired voice. "Just to make sure you're okay," he replied in a soft but threatening tone. Allison ignored him and quickly ended the conversation. She knew Jared wouldn't stop. He was obsessed with her, and now he was acting like a man who had nothing to lose. That evening, the meeting with Andy went great. They had dinner in a cozy restaurant where they discussed the possibility of moving to another city. Andy suggested that they start a new life together, away from what was weighing Allison down. "I don't want you to feel trapped," he said, gently holding her hand. These words made her feel warm, but deep down she felt cold fear. She knew that Jared would not let her just disappear from his life. After dinner, they decided to take a walk through the city at night. The light of the street lamps reflected in the wet pavement, creating the illusion of another reality, one where everything is simple and easy. But when Allison returned home, she felt as if someone was watching her. The next day, Jared showed up outside her apartment again. He was holding a gift box, and he had that familiar smile on his face that made her feel uncomfortable. "This is for you," he said, holding out the box. Allison opened the box and saw inside another locket, almost identical to the one he had given her earlier, but with a new engraving. "Always yours." This was the last straw. She abruptly handed the box back. "Jared, you have to stop. We can't do this anymore. This is not normal." Something dark flashed in his eyes, but he quickly pulled himself together. "You're right," he said. "I guess I overreacted a little. I'm sorry." Allison knew it was just words. She felt that his obsession was turning into something dangerous. The next evening there was a conflict that changed everything. Jared unexpectedly came to Allison's apartment and found her with Andy. His face was contorted with anger, but he forced himself to look calm. "You need to talk to me," he said, ignoring Andy's presence. "No, Jared," she replied firmly. "It's over." Andy stepped in, trying to defend Allison. "Maybe you should leave," he said, trying to avoid conflict. Jared froze for a moment, but his eyes were filled with rage. "You think you can take her? She's mine, always has been, always will be." Allison was frightened, but decided to remain firm. "I'm not yours. I never have been." After saying that, Jared left the apartment, but his look made it clear that it wasn't over. Andy went home that night, and Allison was left alone. She closed the door and finally felt relieved. But this peace did not last long. At night, when everyone else was asleep, she heard sounds no one else had heard, the sounds of struggle and screaming, drowned out by the rain outside her window. There were scattered violets on the floor, a medallion with a broken chain, and footprints that at first seemed chaotic. When the neighbors noticed the door was open the next morning, it was too late. Allison was lying on the floor, dead, her face frozen in a look of fear and strangulation marks on her neck. When detectives Joan Reeves and Marcus Gray arrived at the scene, they were immediately struck by the silence of the apartment where the tragedy had occurred. The light of the morning sun penetrated through the open curtains, illuminating the floor where Allison's lifeless body lay. She was strangled, her face frozen in a look of horror. However, there were no signs of a struggle around her, only a few things lying on the floor, scattered violets and a locket with a broken chain. Joan walked slowly through the room, paying attention to every detail. She noticed that the front door was not broken, which indicated that the victim knew the killer and let him in willingly. "At first glance, there's almost nothing," she said, "but it's too clean." Marcus nodded. He noticed that everything was in its place, except for a few items next to the body. "There's something wrong with these violets," he said, leaning closer. Joan carefully examined the locket that lay next to Allison's hand. There was an engraving on the back. "Always yours." It looked like a symbol of deep affection, or even obsession. Andy was the first to be called in for questioning. He looked confused, but remained calm. They met him at the police station. Marcus started with simple questions. "Did you see Allison the day before?" "Yes, we spent the evening together," Andy answered, looking down. "I left around 11 p.m. "What did you do after that?" "I went home. I ordered food from the app. The courier will confirm that I was home when he delivered the order." Marcus looked at the receipts Andy had provided. The delivery times matched the approximate time of the murder, which gave him an alibi. However, something alarmed the detectives: the violets found at the crime scene. "We know you gave Allison violets," Joan said. "Could they be the same flowers?" "I gave her a bouquet a few days ago, but those flowers should have wilted. I don't know where they came from." Andy seemed sincere, and his alibi was confirmed by the courier delivery. Detectives began to suspect that the flowers might have been a setup. Jared also had an alibi, but it didn't seem convincing. He said he was at home on the night of the murder and was on the phone with a friend around the time of the crime. Joan and Marcus decided to check this information. "I haven't seen Allison lately," Jared said calmly during the interrogation. "But I've been corresponding with her. She was upset because she couldn't find a way out of her situation with Andy." "And when was the last time you spoke to her?" Joan asked. "The day before the murder," he replied. Joan looked up at him. He sounded confident, but his eyes were empty, as if he had thought every word through. Marcus received the phone call report from the cell phone company. The time of Jared's conversation with his friend coincided with the time of the murder. However, something in the story still bothered the detectives. During the subsequent examination of the crime scene, Joan noticed an important detail. The locket with the broken chain was not lying there by chance. Allison seemed to be holding it in her hands at the time of the attack. This indicated that she knew the attacker and was trying to either send a signal or keep the locket as important evidence. Detectives also looked at a receipt from a flower shop that was found among Allison's belongings. It confirmed that the violets were bought by Jared, but the purchase was made the day before her death, the day he claimed not to have seen her. "He bought the same flowers, but he says he didn't meet her?" asked Marcus, turning the receipt in his hands. "He's lying, but why?" This fact raised new questions. Why did Jared buy the flowers if he hadn't planned to meet Allison? And why did they appear near her body, even though he had an alibi? The next step was to gather more evidence from Allison's neighbors. One of them said that he had heard an argument the night before the murder. "She was arguing with someone in her apartment," the neighbor said. "I didn't see who it was, but a man's voice sounded very angry." This added to the suspicions about Jared, but his alibi still stood between him and the accusation. "He was hiding something behind that alibi," Joan said thoughtfully. "Or he was using someone as a cover." Joan and Marcus decided to conduct another interview with Jared. Their strategy was to make him lose control of the situation. They knew that Jared is a person who always tries to control his surroundings, and this trait could help them uncover the truth. They invited him in for questioning and showed him the receipt from the flower shop. "If you didn't see Allison, why did you buy those flowers?" Joan asked, piercing him with her eyes. Jared was silent for a moment. He realized he had made a mistake, but quickly pulled himself together. "I just wanted to make her feel good. But then I changed my mind and didn't go to her." "That's interesting," Marcus said, "because these flowers were found next to her body." This fact threw Jared off balance, and the detectives noticed. He no longer looked as confident as he had at the beginning. Joan Reeves and Marcus Gray knew that the case was coming to a head. Key clues were already pointing to Jared, but his alibi remained intact. He knew how to play on the edge of truth and lies, and now the main task was to find the gap that would make him lose control. The detectives decided to analyze all the collected details once again. They knew that the truth was in the details. Marcus looked again at the receipt from the flower shop. He noticed the time of purchase. The bouquet was purchased exactly 24 hours before Allison's death. The time coincided with the moment when Jared claimed he hadn't seen her. But Joan noticed something even more important. "Marcus, look at this!" She pointed to a small mark at the bottom of the receipt. "It's a cash payment." "What does that tell us?" asked Marcus. He bought the violets knowing they wouldn't leave a trace on the bank statements. It looks like an attempt to hide the purchase. This discovery confirmed their suspicions. Jared wanted to avoid being linked to the violets, but he still left a trail that he hadn't accounted for. The next important step was to understand the meaning of the locket. Joan picked it up again. The engraving, "Always Yours," didn't just symbolize friendship. It was a message of possessiveness. Allison was holding it in her hands when she was dying, Joan said thoughtfully. It could have been more than just a coincidence. Maybe she was trying to leave us a clue. Maybe she wanted us to know who it was, Marcus suggested. Another detail was suspicious. The chain of the locket was broken, indicating physical contact. This meant that during the attack, Allison could have pulled it off her attacker's neck. The detectives decided to review the call data, which, according to Jared, confirmed his alibi. Marcus contacted the cell phone provider and found out that the conversation had indeed taken place, but from a different location than he had claimed. Jared had not spoken to his friend from his own apartment, as he claimed, but from a neighborhood near Allison's house. This mistake was crucial. He could not have known that the police would track the location of the phone during the call. He was near her house at the time of the murder, Marcus concluded, and now we have proof of that. Joan decided to check the messages Allison had received the night before she died. There were several unread messages from Jared on her phone. "I need to talk to you. You can't just leave. You've always been mine, and you know it." The last message came a few minutes before a neighbor heard the argument in Allison's apartment. He was trying to control her even in the last minutes, Joan said. He knew he was losing his grip on her, and it broke him. Detectives put the pieces together. The receipt for the violets, the engraved locket, the call with the false alibi, and the threatening messages. The picture became clear. Jared was obsessed with controlling Allison. When he realized that she had chosen another man, his jealousy and desperation drove him to murder. He couldn't accept that she would leave him, Joan summarized, and he did everything he could to prevent that from happening. Joan Reeves and Marcus Gray began the decisive interrogation of Jared. They now had all the evidence they needed, but it wasn't enough. They needed to put him in a situation where he would lose control and break down, giving up the truth. And they knew. Jared was a master manipulator, but now they had a plan to force him to make a mistake. The interrogation room was quiet, with only the sound of the air conditioner running. Jared sat at the table calmly, confident in his alibi, although behind his outward mask of confidence there was a subtle hint of nervousness. Joan and Marcus entered the room, carrying the evidence that would be the key to his downfall. "Have you figured out why we called you back?" Joan asked, sitting down across from him. Jared smiled slightly. "You're looking in the wrong place again. I told you. I was at home." "Yes, you did," Marcus confirmed, throwing the receipt from the flower shop on the table. "But the flowers you bought were found at the crime scene." "I was just going to give them to her, but I changed my mind," Jared replied without the slightest trace of excitement. "It's strange that you say you haven't met her, but your phone was in the vicinity of her apartment that night," she said. Jared froze for a moment, but quickly composed himself. "My phone could be anywhere. I could have lost it or lent it to someone. That doesn't prove anything." Marcus leaned closer to Jared, showing that they didn't have time for games. "We have something else you'll be interested in. The chain of the locket found next to Allison's body was broken. We believe she tore it off your neck during the struggle." This time Jared couldn't hide his excitement. His fingers began to tap nervously on the table, and his face turned a little pale. He no longer looked so confident. "It's just a coincidence," he said quietly. "You can't prove I was there." "We can," Joan replied calmly. "We have your messages where you threatened her." The last message came a few minutes before the neighbors heard the argument. "And you know what else? You were talking to a friend while you were outside her apartment." Marcus nodded, adding weight to Joan's words. "You lost, Jared. Every little detail points to you. You lost control of the situation as soon as you thought you could control her life." Jared finally realized that all his manipulations had been in vain. He lowered his head and was silent for a long time, and then he spoke, and his voice no longer sounded confident. "She couldn't just leave," he whispered. "She was part of my life. I did everything for her, and she chose someone else. Joan and Marcus listened in silence, letting him pour out his emotions. I went to her that night to talk to her, but she didn't want to listen. She said she didn't need me anymore. And that's when I realized that she was really going to disappear from my life forever. I couldn't let that happen. He was silent for a moment, as if trying to collect his thoughts. I didn't want to kill her, he continued, but she pushed me away. I tried to stop her, but what happened was what happened. It was a confession. He finally admitted his guilt, although he tried to justify his crime as an act of desperation. After the confession, Jared was arrested. Joan and Marcus were relieved. Another case was closed. But it was not a simple victory. It was a reminder of how dangerous manipulation and control can be, especially when it masquerades as friendship and caring. He killed her because he couldn't accept that she chose a different path, Joan said, as she left the interrogation room. People like that don't change, Marcus replied. They always want to control, and when they lose control, they become deadly. A few months after Jared Richards' arrest, the trial took place and became a central event in the life of the town. The case attracted the attention of the local media, as the story of obsession, control, and the brutal murder of a young woman caused a great deal of publicity. People wanted justice for Allison, who was the victim of manipulation. On the opening day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Andy sat in the front row, clenching his fists, while detectives Joan Reeves and Marcus Gray took seats in the audience as key witnesses. Jared, who was now seen by everyone not as a successful man but as a cold-blooded manipulator, sat in the dock, maintaining a calm expression. He looked unperturbed, but his eyes showed inner turmoil. The prosecutor opened the case by describing the circumstances of the crime. He emphasized that Jared wanted to control Allison and could not accept that she was choosing a new life without him. This was not just a murder, the prosecutor said, addressing the jury. It was an act of desperation by a man who had lost control and was willing to do anything to keep his victim. Jared's defense attorney tried to elicit sympathy for his client, explaining his actions as the result of an emotional breakdown. My client did not plan to kill Allison, the lawyer argued. It was a tragedy that happened because of his inability to cope with his feelings. But Joan and Marcus knew it was more than just a tragedy. They were convinced that Jared had carefully considered his actions, adjusting the events to suit himself. Both detectives took the stand in court. Joan Reeves described in detail how they had found the evidence, the torn locket, the violets they had bought, and the mobile data that proved Jared's presence near the apartment on the night of the murder. It was no coincidence, Joan said, looking directly at the jury. Every detail shows that the defendant had carefully planned his actions. Marcus Gray confirmed that their findings coincided with the witness's testimony. He also emphasized that Jared's last messages to Allison were threatening in nature. He told her, "You have always belonged to me." These were not the words of a man who just wanted to talk. Those were the words of a killer. Andy, as one of the closest people to Allison, spoke about how they had planned to start a new life together. He spoke with sadness and bitterness, but also with a determination to get justice. Allison was ready to leave the past behind, but Jared could not accept this. He didn't want to lose his grip on her and decided to stop her once and for all. A psychologist invited by the prosecution described Jared's behavior as a typical example of obsessive control. He explained that manipulators often seek complete power over their victims and cannot tolerate losing control. They create the illusion of caring, but when the victim tries to break out of this circle, it becomes unacceptable to them. This is exactly what happened in Jared's case. The prosecutor concluded his speech by emphasizing that all the evidence pointed irrefutably to Jared's guilt. He asked for the maximum penalty, emphasizing that the murder was the result of his conscious and carefully planned actions. The defense tried to save the defendant by convincing the jury that it was just an emotional disturbance, but their arguments sounded weak against the evidence presented. Allison's family experienced the trial with pain, like an open wound that was reopened over and over again every time the details of her life and death were brought up. Her mother, Susan, and older brother Michael sat in the front rows during the hearings, their faces full of grief and tension. For them, This trial was not only an attempt to get justice, but also a chance to find out what really happened that night. After the hearing, the judge gave the jury time to deliberate. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, like a taut string. Everyone was waiting for the verdict. Susan and Michael tried to avoid looking at Jared, who was sitting in the dock with a cold expression on his face. But at the most tense moment of the trial, during Jared's confession, when he said that he couldn't let her go, Susan couldn't help herself. "You destroyed my daughter," she whispered. Almost a whisper turned into a scream. "She was everything to me." The judge asked her to calm down, but in that moment it was impossible. Her world had fallen apart the night Jared took Allison's life, and no sentence could change that fact. Michael put his arms around his mother's shoulders, comforting her, but his own eyes shone with hatred. He wanted Jared to suffer the same way they had. After several hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. Everyone held their breaths as the lead juror stood up and announced the verdict. The defendant is found guilty of premeditated murder in the first degree. The room erupted in whispers and deafening shouts. Andy lowered his head, but his eyes reflected relief. Joan and Marcus exchanged glances, knowing that justice had been done. The judge asked everyone to calm down and announced the verdict. Jared Richards has been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the crime of first-degree murder. Jared, who had kept his cool until the last moment, now looked broken. He realized that he had finally lost control, not only of Allison, but of his life. After the trial, Andy approached Joan and Marcus to thank them for their work. "Thank you," he said. "Allison finally got justice." Joan nodded. "It was a tough case, but the truth will always find its way." Marcus added, "And the little things are what helped us solve this case. They always make a difference." Andy left the courtroom with a mixture of pain and relief. He knew he had lost the man he loved, but he also knew that justice had been done. Joan and Marcus left the courtroom with a sense of accomplishment. They realized that they could not bring Allison's life back, but now they knew for sure that her story did not end with murder, but with the victory of truth. That's how the case ended. Jared was sent to prison, where he will no longer be able to manipulate or harm others. And the detectives continued their work, knowing that their mission is to find the truth hidden in the smallest details. After the trial, Andy approached Joan and Marcus to thank them for their work. "Thank you," he said. "Allison finally got justice." Joan nodded. "It was a tough case, but the truth will always find its way." Marcus added, "And the little things are what helped us solve this case. They always make a difference." Andy left the courtroom with a mixture of pain and relief. He knew he had lost the man he loved, but he also knew that justice had been done. Joan and Marcus left the courtroom with a sense of accomplishment. They knew they could not bring Allison's life back, but now they knew for sure that her story had ended not with murder, but with the triumph of truth.